On the afternoon of October 17th, 2016, the streets around St. Aidan's Cathedral were already darkening with the early shadows of fall. Inside the century-old stone church, things moved at their usual pace. Quiet footsteps across worn marble, distant organ notes from the chapel balcony, and the soft rustle of parishioners lighting candles beneath stained-glass saints. Father Desmond Keller arrived a few minutes before his scheduled time, just shy of 4 o'clock, wearing the same black coat he always did when the seasons turned. He signed in at the rectory, exchanged a few words with the receptionist, then stepped through the wooden side doors and into the hush of the sanctuary. That evening, the confessional booth was opened for 3 hours, just like every Monday. According to church logs, 3 people entered the booth that night, 2 left. The third never did. Father Keller, now in his 60s, had conducted countless confessions in his decades of service, and nothing about that night felt unusual to him at first. He remembered the first man clearly, a longtime parishioner who came in seeking forgiveness for a bitter family dispute. The second was a woman who spoke in broken sentences and left quickly. The third he couldn't quite place, a man, he thought, maybe in his 40s. He remembered only silence at first, followed by heavy breathing. The voice, when it finally came, was strained, barely more than a whisper. The man had begun to speak, said something about carrying it too long, then stopped. And after that, nothing. It wasn't until the cathedral's closing rounds that something felt off. Just after 8 p.m., a custodian named Luis, making his usual rounds before locking up, noticed that the door to one side of the confessional was slightly ajar. The light inside was still on. The kneeler was extended and the cushion was still warm, but there was no one there. At first, Luis thought maybe someone had walked off mid-confession and forgotten to shut the door. Unusual, but not impossible. Then he saw what had fallen between the booth and the paneling. A phone, face down, still powered on. Next to it, half wedged under the wood trim, was a worn black wallet. Inside the wallet was an ID for a Patrick Hale, age 41, address listed in East River Junction, a few towns away. The phone was password locked, but its lock screen showed multiple missed calls from the same number and a recent message that simply read, "You okay?" Luis flagged down the evening staff, and within half an hour, Father Keller had returned. He insisted he never saw the man's face. The booth was designed for anonymity, divided by a solid wooden panel with a small latticework screen. He recalled hearing the booth door creak open. He remembered the man speaking, faintly. He remembered waiting in silence afterward, assuming he was praying or composing his thoughts. He remembered tapping gently on the screen to see if the man was still there. No answer. At the time, he'd assumed the man had left quietly through the side door. But now, faced with the left-behind belongings, he wasn't so sure. Police arrived just after 9:30 p.m. and cordoned off the area. Officers searched the cathedral from top to bottom, the nave, the transept, the small chapel spaces, even the locked side rooms used for choir storage. The exits had been closed after service. There were no signs of forced entry or escape. A canine unit was brought in to trace the scent. Dogs alerted to the confessional and tracked it briefly into the hallway. But the trail ended cold near the baptismal font, where scent dissipated entirely. St. Aidan's had a full surveillance system installed in 2013, part of a diocese-wide security update following thefts in neighboring parishes. When investigators pulled the footage, they confirmed that Patrick Hale entered the church at exactly 6:47 p.m. The timestamp showed him walking past the central pews, alone, wearing a dark gray jacket and jeans. His phone matched the one found in the booth. His wallet was in his back pocket. He was carrying nothing else. He did not appear rushed or paranoid, just quiet, still, intentional. But nowhere on the footage, from any angle, was he seen leaving. At 7:02 p.m., just 15 minutes after Patrick entered, there was a momentary flicker in the feed. Cameras went black for 6 minutes. When the video resumed, Father Keller was still seated in the booth. No one else was visible. All other entrances remained closed. No one had come or gone in that window, according to the other cameras. The footage was backed up to a cloud server. The missing segment was corrupted in both locations, unrecoverable. Patrick Hale had entered St. Aidan's Cathedral to confess something he hadn't spoken aloud in years. But somewhere between stepping inside and that booth growing cold, he vanished. And as the night deepened and the lights inside the cathedral flickered off one by one, the police were left with one certainty. Someone had come in, but no one had come out. Patrick Hale lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a shuttered antique store in East River Junction. The place didn't stand out. Faded siding, a crooked mailbox, the kind of building most people passed without noticing. But what investigators found inside in the days after he disappeared told a story far more complicated than a man simply seeking confession. When detectives entered the unit with a warrant, the first thing they noticed was the silence. The apartment felt paused, not abandoned. A coffee mug still sat in the sink, half full. A jacket hung neatly by the door. Mail was stacked in a tidy pile on the hallway table. Nothing past due, nothing alarming. But when they stepped into the living room, they found something unexpected. Every electronic device, his television, router, even a basic landline, had been unplugged. His laptop still on. The desk beneath the window was powered down but warm to the touch. When investigators attempted to boot it up, they were met with a black screen demanding two-step authentication and a second key they didn't have. The software wasn't common. It was military-grade encryption, typically used by private security firms and government contractors. Patrick had no known history in either. They brought in digital forensics, but early estimates suggested it would take weeks, maybe months, to get past the first layer of protection. Even attempts to extract peripheral data from the drive yielded nothing. It was a complete digital lockdown. Whoever set it up either had something to hide or something to protect. In the kitchen, taped to the freezer door with blue painter's tape, was a single-lined index card. The handwriting was unmistakably Patrick's, all caps clean, with slight leftward slant. The message read, "It's not just what I did. It's who saw it." No name, no context, but something in the phrasing stuck with investigators. It wasn't guilt he was describing, it was fear. Patrick's sister, Marlene, arrived at the apartment the following day. She'd driven up from Burlington after hearing the news. Visibly shaken, she told detectives that Patrick had been acting strange for months. Not erratic, just different. He'd stopped returning her calls right away, started canceling family dinners. She said he was sleeping less, pacing more, said he'd mentioned mistakes at work and stuff he wasn't supposed to see. But every time she pressed for more, he brushed it off, told her he was handling it. Marlene also recalled one night, a week before he vanished, when Patrick had shown up unexpectedly at her house. He hadn't called first, just knocked on her door with tired eyes and shaking hands. They sat in her kitchen while he drank coffee in silence. Eventually, he told her something was wrong at work, something involving data he wasn't supposed to have access to. Or maybe he was, but not in the way they intended. He'd filed a report, he said, sent it up the chain. But instead of getting answers, he was pulled off the project and moved to a lower security position without explanation. He never said what the data was, only that it didn't make sense, and that someone had noticed he was asking questions. Patrick worked for a mid-sized cloud infrastructure firm based in Portland, a company that specialized in back-end encryption systems for financial clients. Nothing glamorous, but technically sensitive. When investigators reached out to the company's HR department, they confirmed Patrick had been employed there for 7 years, with consistent performance and no disciplinary actions on file. But when asked about the reassignment or the nature of his project, the company declined to comment, citing employee confidentiality and non-disclosure clauses. They offered no support, no speculation, just a short statement expressing sympathy for the family and cooperation with law enforcement. Detectives subpoenaed Patrick's emails and call logs. Most of it was routine: bills, promotions, a few flagged security alerts tied to his account. But one exchange stood out: a string of encrypted messages between Patrick and an internal admin account, flagged only by their timestamps, all sent between midnight and 3 a.m. the week before he disappeared. The contents were locked behind the same encryption used on his laptop. Investigators couldn't prove who was on the other end, but it wasn't a bot. The reply times were too human, too deliberate. Neighbors were also questioned. Most described Patrick as polite but quiet. He wasn't particularly social, but he wasn't reclusive either. One neighbor, a retired mechanic, remembered seeing Patrick sitting in his car some nights, just staring at the dashboard with the engine off. He figured the guy was decompressing after work. Now, he wasn't so sure. There was no suicide note, no sign of struggle, no evidence Patrick had intended to leave town. His bank account hadn't been touched. His passport was untouched in a drawer. His fridge was stocked. Nothing screamed escape. Nothing said he'd planned this. But all of it, the message on the fridge, the locked laptop, the late-night messages, pointed toward something bigger than guilt. Patrick hadn't just brought sin into that confessional. He'd brought a secret, one that, whatever it was, left him more afraid of being seen than being found. By the third day of the investigation, detectives were beginning to suspect that Patrick Hale hadn't simply vanished. He had disappeared in a space where disappearance shouldn't have been possible. St. Aidan's Cathedral was not a sprawling labyrinth. It had 4 main entrances, all monitored by security cameras installed just 3 years earlier. The building's layout was straightforward: a main nave, 2 transept wings, the confessionals, and a rear chapel. Every hallway and doorway was mapped and monitored, and yet Patrick was nowhere to be found after the moment he walked in. The footage was pulled immediately. Investigators began at the outer perimeter and worked inward. At 6:47 p.m., they confirmed a clear shot of Patrick entering through the cathedral's main doors. He moved at a calm pace, wearing the same gray jacket later found inside the confessional. His phone, the one found face down beside the booth, was visible in his hand. He turned toward the east wing, where the confessionals were located, and disappeared from frame as he passed behind a column. The next camera picked him up again. It was a wide-angle feed positioned above the side aisle, capturing the confessional row. At 6:49, Patrick approached the third booth from the end, the one typically used for anonymous confessions. He opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it. Behind him, the booth's vacancy light turned red. From there, the camera held steady. No motion, no exit, no figure reappearing. According to church logs, Father Desmond Keller began confession duties at 6 p.m. sharp. He confirmed under questioning that he remained seated in the priest's side of the booth for nearly the entire hour without stepping out, save for one brief break to check his watch and refill a bottle of water at 6:58. During that time, the red vacancy light on Patrick's side remained lit. Keller remembered the confessor entering but never saw his face, only a voice, low and cracking, coming through the lattice. The man started to speak, something about being watched, about carrying a burden. Then silence. Minutes passed. Keller knocked gently on the partition, asking if he was still there. No response. He assumed the man had quietly slipped out, but the light never turned green, and Patrick was never seen walking away. To investigators, that left one critical question. Where was the exit footage? Every door Patrick could have used to leave the cathedral was under surveillance. All 4 entries, all hallways, every angle that mattered. In theory, there was no blind spot. And yet there was no footage of Patrick Hale leaving the building. Not at 6:50, not at 7, not in the hours that followed. At first, detectives assumed a technical glitch, server failure, camera malfunction, common issues, usually traceable. But when the IT team from the diocese attempted to retrieve the full video archive from that evening, they found something more specific. A 6-minute span from 7:02 p.m. to 7:08 p.m. had been corrupted. Not missing, corrupted. The data existed, but it was unreadable. White static across the screens, color bands and flickering digital noise. It affected every camera on the east wing system, the confessionals, the east hallway, and the secondary entrance door. The rest of the church's video from that evening was intact. Only that window, 6 minutes, was compromised. Even more unsettling was what they found when reviewing the system backups. The cathedral's surveillance feed was mirrored to 2 sources, an internal hard drive and a cloud server managed by an external provider, Both showed the same corruption in the same time window. The internal logs listed no unauthorized access, no tampering, no power surges, no explanation. The cathedral's head of maintenance, a quiet man named Elias Boyd, told detectives he'd been on site that evening and had noticed no issues with the system. He remembered the lights dimming once briefly, but assumed it was the old wiring, something that happened from time to time when the HVAC kicked on. He never lost power. The building never went dark. And yet, something had cut clean through the digital record. With nowhere else to turn, police brought in a forensic video analyst from the state's cybercrime unit. She examined the raw files frame by frame, looking for metadata anomalies, time code breaks, even signs of internal sabotage. What she found was inconclusive. The files hadn't been deleted and reinserted. They hadn't been edited in post. Whatever had happened to them had happened during the recording process, as if something had pulsed through the system and erased only the precise moments it needed to. By now, the investigation had shifted tone. It was no longer just about where Patrick had gone. It was about why the system designed to watch had chosen not to see. In an interview 2 weeks later, Father Keller sat quietly across from the lead detective and recounted again what he'd heard from the other side of that wooden screen. He said the voice was male, mid to late 40s, quiet but deliberate. He remembered the man saying something about bringing it here because there was nowhere else. Then he paused, swallowed, and added something he hadn't told anyone before. He cried, Keller said, not loudly, just steady, for a few minutes, like he'd already decided something and was mourning it. The detective asked why Keller hadn't mentioned that detail earlier. Because I wasn't sure it was grief, he said. It almost sounded like relief. By the time the footage resumed at 7:08 p.m., the confessional was closed. The red vacancy light had turned off. No one was visible in the hall. No door had opened. No figure had walked out. Just silence. And Patrick Hale, who entered on camera, was now gone without a trace. The following morning, under gray skies and a steady drizzle, investigators returned to St. Aidan's to conduct a more thorough sweep of the East Wing. This time, they weren't just reviewing footage or retracing known paths. They were looking for something they might have missed, something structural, something hidden. Luis, the custodian who had originally found the phone and wallet, walked them through what he'd noticed the night Patrick disappeared. He pointed to the confessional door, how it was slightly ajar, the interior light still glowing, the kneeler cushion faintly warm to the touch. It had unnerved him then, and standing in front of it again, it clearly still did. Detectives pulled the booth apart slowly. It was a traditional wooden structure, constructed decades ago from thick oak panels with 2 separate compartments, one for the confessor, one for the priest. The seating was fixed, the kneeler too. But behind the penitent's kneeling area, something didn't sit right. A faint draft was coming through the wall near the baseboards. On closer inspection, a rectangular wooden panel had warped slightly outward. When they removed it, they found what looked like a ventilation duct, old, narrow, and rusted around the edges. The metal grate inside had snapped at 2 of the 4 corners, and one of the screws was missing entirely. Whoever had been in the booth may have kicked at it or pulled it loose deliberately. Behind the grate was a small cavity, just large enough for someone to crawl through on hands and knees. It led into a dark channel between the cathedral's outer and inner walls, part of a forgotten circulation system from an era before electric air conditioning. Technically, it was accessible, but maneuvering through it would be difficult, especially for a grown man, and the duct didn't lead directly outside. It turned sharply into the foundation and vanished beneath the stone flooring of the East Wing. Investigators sent in a flexible camera rig to trace the path. The channel went only about 12 feet before hitting a dead end, a sealed stone partition, likely from a renovation decades earlier. There were no footprints, no discarded clothing, no tools or rope or evidence of planning. Just dust. Decades of it. Forensics teams brought in sniffer dogs, hoping to pick up Patrick's trail inside the church itself. The dogs were led through every aisle, up to the choir loft, into the crypt beneath the sanctuary, and around the side hallways. They showed immediate interest in the confessional booth, sniffing intensely at the kneeling area and the open grate. But from there, the trail led straight into the main nave, then stopped, abruptly, halfway down the central aisle. No diversion, no detour, just gone. One handler, a veteran of search and rescue operations, said it was unusual. Scent doesn't just vanish unless something interrupts it. Wind, water, time. But the cathedral hadn't been aired out. The doors were closed. It hadn't rained inside. And it hadn't been long enough for scent to decay completely. For it to simply stop suggested one of two things. Patrick had gone somewhere completely sealed, or something had removed every trace of him from that spot forward. The working theory became increasingly unsettling. Perhaps Patrick had squeezed into the wall cavity and tried to find another exit. Maybe he'd gotten stuck. Maybe he was still inside the cathedral somewhere, trapped, or worse. Thermal imaging scanners were brought in, scanning the walls, crawl spaces, and attic cavities for any unusual heat signatures, anything that might suggest human presence, however faint. They found nothing. Not even residual warmth in the crawl spaces. Just the cold imprint of an old building sealed in stone and wood. The confessional booth itself, now fully disassembled for forensic review, yielded one final discovery. In the lower right corner of the inner paneling, just below the kneeling shelf, were a series of shallow etchings. They were easy to miss, hidden in the grain of the wood, only visible at the right angle under a forensic light wand. At first glance, they looked like minor damage, scratches from a shoe or a belt buckle. But under closer inspection, the pattern became clear. 28 short, deliberate strokes, each roughly the same length, each etched with just enough pressure to score the wood without splitting it. 28 lines grouped in fives, 4 complete sets and 8 standalone marks. Tally marks. Someone had kept count. Of what, no one could say. Visits, confessions, people, or days. When shown the markings, Father Keller admitted he'd never noticed them before. But then again, he rarely looked beneath the kneeler. The booths were old and no one had thought to examine the wood this closely until now. But what troubled him most wasn't the number of marks. It was the placement. The only person who could have reached that corner easily, the only one low enough, close enough, pressed in tightly enough to scratch marks into that space, was the penitent. Whoever knelt there, whoever stayed there, whoever came back. The team documented the scratches, sent high-resolution photos to pattern analysts, and sealed the booth off from public use indefinitely. But no further evidence emerged, no new scent trails, no blood, no fibers, just the broken grate, the dead-end duct, and the marks that suggested someone had been counting. Maybe Patrick had discovered the marks himself that night. Maybe he added one more. Or maybe he wasn't the first to kneel there and vanish. 2 weeks after Patrick Hale's disappearance, a call came into the local precinct from a nursing facility on the outskirts of Portland. The caller identified himself as Father William Rourke, retired, 87 years old, and formerly a priest at St. Aidan's Cathedral. His voice was faint, cracked with age, but steady. He told the detective on the line that he had heard about the missing man from the cathedral. And then, in a tone more resigned than frightened, he said, "This has happened before." Detectives drove out that same afternoon to speak with him in person. Father Rourke was confined to a recliner, oxygen tubes feeding into his nose, his lap covered in a blanket from the church's old Easter drives. The room was dim and the blinds were drawn. He didn't move much, but his eyes were sharp when the investigators walked in. He explained that back in the spring of 1993, while he was still leading Monday evening confession, a man had come into the cathedral, alone, quiet, just after sundown, and never left. He remembered the man's appearance vaguely, mid-30s, unshaven, likely homeless, with a canvas duffel slung across his back. He'd knelt in the same confessional where Patrick later would, third from the end in the east wing. Father Rourke heard a few words, something about seeing something he shouldn't have, then a long silence. When he tapped on the screen, there was no answer. He waited 5 more minutes. Still nothing. Assuming the man had slipped out, Rourke had moved on to the next confessor. Later that night, a custodian found the man's duffel sitting in the confessional. It held only a few items, a wool blanket, some canned food, and a pocket Bible. There was no ID, No wallet, no name inside the book. Police were called, a report was filed, but nothing came of it. The man wasn't reported missing, no one came forward. The case was dismissed as a likely transient who wandered off or intentionally abandoned his belongings. But Father Rourke said something about the incident never sat right with him. He remembered the man's voice, the fear in it, and the silence that followed. After that night, Rourke began keeping his own records. Not formal confession logs, but a private account of anything that felt off. He never submitted them to the diocese. He didn't want to cause concern or speculation, but he kept them. He pointed the detectives toward a wooden footlocker at the base of his bookshelf, filled with old hymnals and loose church programs. Inside, tucked between pages of a water-damaged hymnal from 1993, was a single sheet of lined paper, yellowed and brittle at the edges. On it were a few scribbled lines. April 12th, late confessor. Rough voice, did not exit, left belongings, no ID, same booth. No police follow-up, no name, just fear. Note in hymnal pocket, he knows about the mirror. Initials, P. Hale. That last line made the room go quiet. Detectives looked at each other. Patrick Hale would have been in his late teens in 1993. There was no indication he'd ever been to St. Aidan's at that age. But the priest said he remembered seeing the name once, not in a report, but written faintly in pencil on the inside cover of another hymnal left in the pew near the confessional days after the man vanished. He thought nothing of it at the time. But now, hearing the name again, it came flooding back. When asked about the line, he knows about the mirror, Father Rourke became visibly tense. His breathing slowed. He looked toward the corner of the room, then back at the detectives. "There's more in that church than what we're supposed to see," he said. "Some things aren't for us." They pressed him for details, but he waved them off, said it was best left where it is. That night, the detectives made photocopies of the log and returned the original to him per his request. He promised to call if he remembered more, but he never did. Father Rourke died in his sleep 3 weeks later. Natural causes. Heart failure, the attending nurse said. He passed sometime after 3 a.m., peacefully, with no signs of distress. The note he'd written, the one inside the hymnal, was examined by handwriting experts. The initials P. Hale were confirmed to match the handwriting found on Patrick's fridge note, though the ink was decades old. Whether Patrick had been to the cathedral as a teenager, or whether someone else had linked his name to that earlier disappearance, remained unknown. The phrase about the mirror took on a life of its own in the weeks that followed. Detectives searched the booth, the surrounding, walls, even behind the altar, looking for a literal mirror. Nothing turned up, but something about that phrasing, about being seen or reflecting something back, began to feel less metaphorical and more like a warning, or a message meant for someone who'd already seen too much. And in a file, now marked Archived Active Inquiry, 2 names sat beneath one another, both attached to the same confessional, both vanished decades apart. The mystery surrounding Patrick Hale had grown heavy with silence. With no new sightings, no usable footage, and no traceable digital footprint, investigators found themselves circling the same questions with fewer and fewer answers. But a break, unexpected and strange, came not from modern surveillance or forensic evidence, but from a set of documents pulled from the county's historical archives, original architectural blueprints of St. Aidan's Cathedral, dated 1894. The diagrams were hand-drawn, yellowed at the edges with notations in faded ink. At first glance, the layout resembled the modern-day floor plan, nave, transept, sanctuary. But deeper into the roll, tucked beneath a folded flap, was something else. A second drawing, annotated in a different hand, marked a level beneath the current structure. A narrow chamber extended under the east wing, labeled only as Ordo Paenitentiae, or Order of Penance. It was roughly the size of a freight elevator shaft, descending from behind the altar wall down into what appeared to be a vaulted stone corridor. No such feature was shown on any contemporary records. The diocese had no record of it either. When contacted, the archdiocesan office explained that renovations in the 1950s and again in the early 1980s had altered much of the cathedral's original design. and it was not uncommon for older spaces to be bricked off, sealed, or repurposed without documentation surviving. Most churches from that era had crypts, storage, or isolation chambers below ground, some still in use, others long forgotten. But this chamber, in particular, had never come up in any maintenance logs or floor inspections. Investigators brought in a LiDAR team, ground-penetrating radar technicians who had worked on historic site surveys before. Over the course of several hours, the east wing was scanned in precise detail. The data was converted into a 3D rendering, layer by layer, peeling back the cathedral's stonework and plaster. Behind the altar wall, directly behind the confessional booth area, was a cavity, roughly 15 feet tall, unaccounted for in any current plans. Below that, another hollow, longer, wider, arched like a tunnel. Something was buried inside the walls. Excavation was authorized under court order. Within a week, construction crews began chipping away at the east wall, carefully removing sections of brick and mortar. Behind the outer layer, they found another wall, older, rougher, and mortared with a darker, binding compound consistent with 19th century construction. This second wall bore a faint engraving near the top, a small circle carved around a Latin cross. The cross had been deliberately chiseled halfway off. When the inner wall finally gave way, a passage opened into a hidden corridor no more than 5 feet wide. The air inside was dry, musty, and faintly sweet, the smell of old incense and decay. At the corridor's end was a small chamber arched like a crypt, with soot-stained stone and a raised platform built from stacked limestone blocks. Scattered across the floor were the remnants of old wax candles, long since melted into warped puddles. Fragments of burned paper littered the corner, along with clumps of something darker, tufts of human hair, tangled and brittle. Nearby lay a coat, shredded, torn at the shoulders, one sleeve missing entirely. It matched the description given by Patrick's sister, gray with a stitched lining and a loose front button. Lying beside it was a rosary, its crucifix warped as if partially melted, its beads dulled with grime on one side and unnaturally smooth on the other, polished, it seemed, by repeated handling. But there was no body, no bones, no trace of anyone living or dead. Forensic teams swept the chamber for DNA, blood, or biological traces and were able to recover partial mitochondrial DNA from the coat fibers, a familial match to Patrick Hale. The hair found on the floor belonged to a male, but testing was inconclusive due to degradation. There were no signs of a struggle, no tool marks, no evidence of recent structural collapse or violence, just the artifacts, left behind, arranged in a way that felt deliberate. When questioned, longtime clergy and maintenance staff had no knowledge of the chamber. It had never come up in plumbing records, HVAC installations, or renovations. No one knew it was there. The raised platform, once assumed to be a crypt base, had no inscriptions, no drawers, no visible markings at all. But under thermal imaging, faint temperature differentials suggested something was embedded within the stone itself, possibly a sealed compartment, unreachable without dismantling the structure entirely. Permission for deeper excavation was denied by the diocese. They argued that without a body, the site should be preserved, not destroyed. The room was resealed under official orders. The coat, rosary, and hair samples were cataloged and moved to evidence storage. And just like that, what had seemed like the first real lead in months, a chamber hidden beneath a holy place, a coat, a rosary, a name whispered in records, ended in silence again. No answers, just a question now etched into the stone of the cathedral. Why was that chamber sealed, and why did it wait over a century before revealing itself? On the morning of September 8, 2025, a clerk arrived to open a 24-hour convenience store on the north edge of East River Junction. The building had been closed for routine maintenance the night before, its doors locked and systems idle, but sometime around 3 a.m., a motion-triggered silent alarm had gone off. The alert wasn't flagged as urgent, just a system ping, automatically recorded and filed. The overnight manager reviewed it out of habit while completing the opening checklist. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The aisles were untouched, registers balanced, doors secure. But when she pulled up the footage tied to the alarm, she paused. There, captured on camera at 3:12 a.m., was a man stepping out of the single-occupancy restroom at the back of the store. He wore dark jeans, a gray jacket with a high collar, and walked with a slight tilt in his left shoulder, identical to the posture seen in the 2016 cathedral entry footage. He didn't glance around, didn't look at the cameras. He moved in a direct line from the restroom to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped into the alley. The lock had been tampered with. Nothing was stolen. But what stunned the manager wasn't what the man did. It was what he didn't have. The footage, captured in 4K definition, showed every detail in the store with perfect clarity. The shelves, the lights, the tile floor, even the dirt smudge near the ice machine. But the man's face, the portion of the image where his face should have been, was blank, not pixelated, not obscured by glare. It was blurred, but only that area, as though smudged out by a digital hand. It moved with him, as if part of the recording itself had warped around that one square of identity. Confused, the manager replayed it. Same result. She sent the clip to her supervisor, who forwarded it to the local police station, unsure if it was vandalism, a software bug, or something worse. Within hours, detectives had copies. By noon, analysts were combing through the footage frame by frame. The rest of the image held steady. The man's clothing, his shoes, even the way his fingers curled slightly inward when he walked, all matched the archived footage of Patrick Hale entering St. Aidan's Cathedral nearly 9 years earlier. Investigators retrieved that original video and ran a side-by-side comparison. Height, within an inch. Gait, identical. Shoulder tilt, identical. Estimated age, consistent with someone now in his 50s. But the most disturbing anomaly wasn't the blurred face, it was the shadow. During one brief moment, as the man passed under an overhead light near the slush machine, his shadow stretched along the wall behind him. Most of it was normal, the elongated arms, the movement of his stride. But from the shoulders up, there was nothing. The shadow ended in a rounded slope, like a torso missing a head. Technicians ran diagnostics on the security system. Nothing was altered, no filters, no tampering. The cameras were hardwired, the footage time-stamped, the data stream uninterrupted. They tested lighting conditions to rule out fluke shadow angles. They replaced bulbs and reviewed hardware logs. Everything checked out. The camera had recorded what it saw, and what it saw had no face. Once the footage was leaked, it spread online within hours. News stations picked it up the next day. The man in the video was dubbed the Blurred One, and soon the usual theories began to emerge. Advanced facial scrambling tech, glitching AI deepfakes, performance art. Paranormal communities latched onto it instantly, some tying it to digital possession, others to obscure folk beliefs about people who surrendered their image. But in East River Junction, among those who still remembered the 2016 disappearance of Patrick Hale, the reaction was quieter, uneasy. Patrick's sister, Marlene, was shown the footage privately by investigators. She watched it once, twice, then again in silence. When asked if she believed it could be him, she hesitated. "It walks like him," she said. "He had this way of dragging one foot when he was tired, and the jacket looks the same. But that face," she trailed off. "For years I prayed to see him again, but not like this." Digital experts from 3 separate forensic labs were brought in to analyze the footage. They confirmed that no corruption existed outside the bounds of the blurred section. No metadata had been altered. The video was native and untampered with. One analyst concluded that for the blur to occur as it did, it would require an in-camera effect running live, which, according to the hardware, was not possible. Another proposed electromagnetic interference. A third simply said, "There's no reason this should have happened." Detectives canvassed the area around the store but found no witnesses. No one saw a man matching that description enter or leave. No other cameras picked him up. The alley door showed signs of forced manipulation, but it wasn't broken, just bypassed, as if someone had known exactly how to access it without leaving damage. There were no fingerprints, no shoe prints, no DNA. The restroom was clean, the light was off, and in the weeks that followed, the man never appeared again. The footage remains, archived in multiple drives, reviewed repeatedly by experts looking for a rational answer. But as of yet, no one can explain how a man walked into a locked store, passed a high-definition camera, left no trace behind, and left only a face-shaped blank space in the record of his return. 3 weeks after the footage from the convenience store went public, the man responsible for maintaining that store's security system was found dead in his apartment. His name was Colin Myers, 32 years old, contract technician, employed by a small local surveillance company that handled installations and routine maintenance for businesses across the region. By all accounts, he was reliable, meticulous, and good at his job. But in the days after the footage aired, those close to him noticed a shift. Coworkers said Colin had been increasingly withdrawn. He stopped replying to after-hours group chats, missed 2 appointments. When pressed, he simply said he hadn't been sleeping. One employee, who'd trained alongside him, claimed Colin had become fixated on the Patrick Hale video, watching it on loop in the editing suite during breaks, zooming in, adjusting frame rates, overlaying motion blur correction algorithms. He insisted something was hidden inside the footage, something no one else had noticed. On September 29th, Colin didn't show up to work. Calls went unanswered. That evening, a coworker stopped by his apartment and, after getting no response, contacted police. When officers entered the unit, they found no signs of forced entry. The door was locked from the inside. There was no struggle. Colin was seated at his desk, head resting on his forearms, a bottle of prescription sleep medication half empty beside him. Toxicology would later confirm an intentional overdose. On the desk, beneath his arm, was a sheet of printer paper with 8 words printed in all caps. "I shouldn't have enhanced it. Some faces are hidden for a reason." The note was unsigned. No other messages were found in the apartment. On the corner of the desk sat a labeled USB drive, a cheap plastic model marked in red ink with the word HALE. Forensics verified it hadn't been tampered with or altered after Colin's death. The drive contained a single file, a video, dated 2 days earlier. It was an edited version of the now infamous convenience store footage. Colin had applied frame stabilization and advanced exposure correction, isolating the blurred region and attempting to reconstruct movement through pixel interpolation. The edit was subtle. Most of the footage looked unchanged. But there was one moment, just after the figure exits the restroom and begins to walk toward the back exit, where something happens. The man pauses. It's only for a second, maybe 2, but in that moment, his body slows and his head turns directly toward the camera. The blur remains, but the motion within it shifts, just enough to suggest the outline of a mouth. The lips move, once, a single phrase silently spoken. Analysts brought in professional lip readers from 3 different agencies to interpret the footage. They isolated the frames, adjusted contrast, slowed the video to 20% speed, and reviewed the movement dozens of times. But no consensus emerged. One group believed the phrase was, "still here." Another was convinced it said, "don't confess." A third interpretation, more obscure, suggested, "you saw me." The lack of clarity only deepened the discomfort. The figure had not just walked through the store unseen. He had looked directly at the one place that couldn't stop watching. Colin's employer released a short statement expressing condolences to his family and noted that the footage he'd been reviewing was not part of any official assignment. His enhancements were done on personal time, using his own equipment. There would be no further investigation from the company's side. Privately, detectives weren't so quick to dismiss it. They reviewed Colin's laptop and found multiple folders filled with still frames from the original footage, annotated with small notes. Muzzle twitch here, shoulder sinks bar step, lips move, unclear intent. There were screenshots of heat maps, motion trails, contrast overlays. In one file, he'd circled the figure's hand and written, "ring." Too clean. Another simply said, "eyes?" Or just the idea of eyes. His browser history showed late-night searches for facial scrubbing software, camera anomalies, and ancient theological references to veiled saints, a niche term linked to depictions of martyrs whose identities were erased or concealed. In the final days before his death, Colin had made no purchases, sent no emails, and made no calls beyond basic work communication. His phone was found, powered off, placed gently beside the USB on his desk. It held no voicemails, no recent messages, no photos beyond those from months prior. But one app was open, the security camera viewer from the convenience store. He had watched the same clip 74 times in a 48-hour window. When the footage was later shown on national television as part of a news segment about the resurgence in the Hale case, producers were asked not to include the enhanced version. Authorities feared the gesture, the figure looking into the camera, the words no one could agree on, would only inflame speculation. But even without it, the footage continued to circulate in private forums. People claimed to hear static or whispers when they played it. Others said the footage changed subtly depending on when and where it was viewed. These were easily dismissed. But the suicide of a man whose job was to reveal truth and whose final act was to leave behind something meant to be hidden was harder to ignore. Colin Myers didn't know Patrick Hale. He had no reason to alter the video except for curiosity, but something he saw in that blurred face, or maybe in the space where a face should have been, convinced him that the act of revealing carried its own cost. And now, Patrick had looked back. By early 2026, St. Aidan's Cathedral had returned to its rhythm. Masses resumed. Tourists passed through in quiet reverence. The tape around the east wing was removed, and with the bishop's reluctant approval, the confessional where Patrick Hale had last been seen was reopened. The renovations were minimal: new paneling, reinforced walls, updated lighting, all efforts to ease the building's history back into routine. The diocese issued a statement urging parishioners to move forward with grace, reminding the congregation that the booth was a place for healing, not fear. But as the weeks passed, reports began to surface, subtle at first: a draft across the ankles while kneeling, even when the church was sealed, a sense of pressure in the chest during prayer, whispers, faint and unplaceable, behind the lattice screen even when the priest was absent. The staff chalked it up to lingering anxiety. Rumors, stirred by a community that hadn't forgotten the man who entered and never exited. Then came more detailed accounts. A parishioner, an elderly woman who had attended the church since her baptism, claimed she heard a man's voice while inside the booth, even though no one was seated across from her. He said something about a mirror. Another, younger man, described a sensation like static in his ears, followed by what he could only describe as a name being swallowed before it reached him. None of them reported fear exactly. What they described instead was something more unnerving: the unshakable feeling that someone was listening in. Father Adrian Weiss, newly transferred from out of state, took over confessional duties that spring. He was 39, methodical, and known for his open-mindedness. When the whispers were first mentioned, he dismissed them gently. When they continued, and when he heard faint clicking sounds one evening while sitting alone behind the screen, he decided to start recording. Not to investigate, he later said, but to understand. He installed a small, battery-powered audio recorder just beneath his side of the booth. It was voice-activated, time-stamped, and rotated to a fresh SD card each week. For most of the first month, the files were unremarkable: quiet ambient noise, creaking wood, occasional coughs. Nothing stood out. Until May 14th. That night, according to church logs, no one entered the confessional between 2 and 3 a.m. The cathedral had closed at midnight. Security footage confirmed the doors remained locked and motionless. But when Father Weiss reviewed the audio from that window the next morning, he froze. At exactly 2:43 a.m., the recorder activated. The first 15 seconds were muffled: ambient hum, a faint gust, maybe wind bleeding through the walls. Then came a string of low whispers, layered, overlapping, unintelligible, not Latin, not English, just fragments, breath-like, then silence. Then, at the 42-second mark, a voice, male, mid-range, calm, faint. He took the face to keep the name, then nothing. The file ended at 107. Father Weiss immediately brought the file to the diocese and, under advisement, handed it over to investigators. The audio was run through forensic analysis. There were no signs of splicing, digital tampering, or artificial manipulation. It was a clean recording, captured at the advertised time. The whispers were degraded by ambient interference, no usable linguistic patterns, but the final sentence was intact. They compared the voice to archival audio of Patrick Hale, voicemail messages, a recorded work seminar, and a family home video from 2011. Voice match software yielded a tentative match, approximately 82% certainty. The pacing, vocal strain, and consonant timing were consistent with Patrick's known speech patterns. Still, the recording raised more questions than it answered. Who had spoken? What did the phrase mean? He took the face to keep the name. Was it metaphor? A warning? A clue? The cathedral remained open, but whispers spread again. Some parishioners refused to enter the east wing. Others began leaving handwritten prayers tucked into the booth's edges. The confessional had become less a place of repentance and more a monument to something unfinished. The priest who heard the whisper never stepped into the booth again after that night. He requested reassignment within the month. In the back of the cathedral, near the votive candles, someone left a folded paper on the ledge below the stained glass. It contained only a single line, in block letters: "If he has no face, he can be anyone." The handwriting did not match any parishioner records. Security footage from that evening, the time the note was believed to have been placed, showed no one entering or exiting the church. Just stillness, and a booth where, some say, the air still shifts, as if someone is kneeling there long after the light has gone out. On the night of December 4th, 2025, just after midnight, motion sensors were triggered in the east courtyard of St. Aidan's Cathedral. The church was closed, the gates locked, the surrounding walkways empty. The responding officer arrived within minutes, expecting a stray animal or a drifting branch, routine false alarms in cold months. Instead, he found a man standing barefoot in the snow beside the old stone fountain, staring up at the bell tower. He made no move to run, no move at all. The man wore a thin, oversized coat, no shoes, no gloves. His hands were folded in front of him, skin pale and weathered, as though he'd been outside for hours. But there was no frostbite, no shivering, no signs of distress. When the officer approached, he remained still. He didn't speak, didn't resist. When asked for ID, he didn't respond. When asked his name, nothing. At first glance, his face looked wrong. Not deformed, not swollen, just blank. Not blank in the literal sense, but stripped. His nose was flattened, the cartilage sunken. His eyes were sunken too, rimmed by skin that looked melted at the edges. There's no eyebrows, no eyelashes. His lips were discolored. The overall impression was that of a man who had been badly burned and never fully healed, but there were no fresh wounds, no scabbing, no open trauma, just smooth pink scarring. A face without distinction. Fingerprint scans were attempted on site. No match. At the station, a full biometric workup revealed something stranger. His hands lacked the typical ridge patterns, not worn down, not faded, absent, as though the prints had been removed intentionally. His teeth, what few remained, were yellowed and slightly crooked, but bore no dental record match. A DNA sample was taken. Weeks later, the results returned as inconclusive, not unmatched, scrambled, as if corrupted mid-process. Analysts at the lab re-ran the test twice. Same result. The markers didn't align with any known profiles, including familial connections to Patrick Hale. The man was held for trespassing and temporarily remanded to the psychiatric observation wing at a nearby hospital. Nurses said he was cooperative, if silent. He slept regularly, ate without issue, and showed no signs of aggression. He refused to speak, write, or gesture. But during the third night of observation, a nurse named Elaine Corbett, making rounds just after 2 a.m., claimed she saw something that made her stop cold. She passed his room, as she had each night, expecting to see him asleep. But he was awake, sitting upright in the bed, staring at the blank television screen on the wall. His hands were still folded in his lap, his posture calm. As she paused in the doorway, she saw his lips move. Just once. She couldn't hear the sound, but she recognized the motion, the phrase from the surveillance footage. She'd seen it dozens of times when the Patrick Hale story went viral. Still here. Or maybe, don't confess, she wasn't sure which. The hospital had security footage from the hallway, but the interior of his room wasn't monitored. There was no way to confirm what she saw. But when investigators later asked her to describe the exact timing and position, it aligned nearly to the second, with the same timestamp from the original footage. 3:12 a.m. The man, still unidentified, was eventually transferred to a long-term psychiatric care facility under a court order. He was assigned a case number, no name. His file grew thicker with each week. Staff reported that mirrors in his room fogged strangely around his face, that his presence sometimes set off the building's proximity sensors, that though he never spoke, his mouth often moved during the night, forming shapes that never became sound. Attempts to identify him publicly were fruitless. Facial recognition failed. No tips led anywhere. Even Patrick Hale's sister, when shown photos, could only stare. "That's not him," she whispered, "but I think it might be what's left." Authorities, faced with the lack of forensic proof and the impossibility of what stood before them, left Patrick Hale's case officially open. Not because they didn't know where he was, but because they no longer knew who he was. In the cathedral, the confessional remains. People still kneel, still pray, still wonder what was left behind in that booth nearly a decade ago, and what came out in its place. And somewhere behind a locked door, in a facility that doesn't list names on its directory, a man without a face sits in silence, waiting for someone to recognize him or to forget.